Well, hey everybody. Thanks again for joining with us. My name's Lance. I'm a pastor at Communion in San Diego, and I've got the pleasure of having a conversation with my good friend Joe Priola. Joe, hello. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, buddy. Good afternoon.
You
Thanks for
wanna
having.
just absolutely. You wanna quickly introduce yourself and what you and your family are up to right now?
Yeah, yeah. Well, as you said, my name's Joe. My friends call me Joe. Um,
What do your
and
enemies call you?
probably can't say on this show, but good to be here with you. Friend of Lance's and some common work together here in our city of San Diego. I'm from the area. I grew up in North County, Bonsall Oceanside area. And my wife and I have served with the Ministry of Cru, or formerly known as Campus Crusade for Christ, for almost 20 years now.
Wow, there you go.
The first 18 of those were on the college campuses up on the Central Coast and back here in San Diego as area directors. And now the last couple of years, we've been working in the city more with young adults, young professionals in the marketplace.
Right on.
Yeah.
Well, I thought it would be great, especially in this moment, to talk about what it looks like to love your neighbor. And one of the main reasons I've instantly thought of you, having you on in this conversation, is I remember talking about our own shared longings and seeing the city flourish. And you'd mentioned yourself as the pastor for the unchurched, or someone who loves people who aren't necessarily in the church community. And I thought, what a great opportunity just to have a conversation around what it looks like for God's people to love their neighbors on their street really well, especially in such an uncertain moment where you can't give handshakes or hugs or really even go into people's houses. Like, what does it look
Yeah.
like right now to love our neighbors? And so I thought I'd just set the stage a little bit, and then I've got some guiding questions for you that we'll go through. Um, but what I think is really important is for followers of Jesus to understand that we are foretastes of the kingdom. What that means is we're here on this earth in creation to reveal God's nature, his love, his compassion, to reveal the gospel story, and to ultimately reveal the work that Jesus has done on the cross for everyone. But the main problems that I think we have as followers of Jesus today is we think the work of mission or the work of loving your neighbor is done by the church as an organization. My
Mhm.
air quotes here. And not necessarily something all followers of Jesus participate or join in. So I remember listening the first time. I can't remember who says it. Maybe you'll know. But that quote that says, "It's not the church who has a mission, but the God of mission who has a church." And how that
Mhm.
paradigm shifts our understanding of each of us, our individual involvements in what God's doing in the world. So instead, mission's not done by a church organization. It's not a ministry. It's not I don't know, like a section within the church, but mission or
Sure.
loving and sharing the message of Jesus is something done by everyone. And we get to join God and participate in what he's already doing in the neighborhood, as opposed to us creating a new mission for the church itself. But we're called to be God's reconciling presence, to participate with his work of renewing and reconciling all things to himself. I've heard the metaphor, and maybe it's especially pertinent right now, that the church is, in some sense, like an antibody working against the forces of evil in the world, revealing the kingdom and God's love for his people. And that's something all of us, every single follower of Jesus, gets to participate in as we look at loving our neighbors. And that becomes kind of the ordinary and maybe the most pertinent work that the really being on mission reveals itself in being, as loving those people who are to our left and our right, on our street, our coworkers, people we meet all throughout the city. And we get to participate in doing that together. And so that was me just kind of setting the stage, and I'd love to ask you some pertinent questions and have a conversation around, since we know that all God's people are, in some sense, supposed to display this love. I'd like to start just generally. Can you give us maybe an idea, a feeling, maybe some theology around why we should love our neighbors as followers of Jesus right now?
Yeah. Man, that was a great, I would say, introduction. I almost feel like we could just end there. That'd be good enough.
No way. We need some.
Mission.
We need some legs.
Sounds good. I I appreciate what you shared. I think what I first heard when you shared those thoughts initially, and we can transition into your question, is really that the church is not a building.
Right.
It's a people.
Mm-hmm.
It's the people of God, as you said, working as an antibody. It's God's methodology for advancing His kingdom, cultivating His kingdom in the world. And so, yeah, the God of mission has a church, a people. And so, if the vocation of God is the reconciling of the world to Himself and the renewing of creation, then our calling, our vocation, is to live into that. Our
Absolutely.
vocation is to live out that mission by participating with what God is doing. So I think that's
Mm-hmm.
super important to remember, is that God is always at work, um,
Yeah.
even in COVID, believe it or not, that God is at work. And part of my job, your job, our job as His people is to see where He's at work and
Mm-hmm.
to tap into that and participate with Him in that. So, but with respect to just, yeah, the loving your neighbor piece, look, I do this imperfectly. I'm a practitioner who's flawed. But quite simply, the way I see it, and just from understanding the scriptures, is that um, the invitation for us as we seek to love God how we do that is by loving our neighbors well. Sometimes we look at our faith maybe as personal, which certainly is deeply as a personal thing, but we also tend to want to make it private.
Right.
And I think that's one of the greatest challenges we often face is we want to keep it personal and private. But realistically, the scriptures and the Spirit compel us to live out our faith in the public square, in the public
Amen.
arena. And so
Yeah.
the opportunities for us mean, what does it look like for us to love God in the public square, in the public arena, in outside of our homes with our neighbors? So in a sense, how do we love God? If that's the greatest command, and Matthew 22, there's this beautiful text where the scribes and some teachers of the law are trying to nail Jesus or paint Him in a
Yeah.
corner, and they ask Him what's the most important commandment, and He says it's to love he calls on the Shema, to listen, hear, O Israel, the Lord God is one, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And then He says, and what is equally important, a second is equally important, Jesus says in verse 39 of chapter 22, is to love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
It says the entire law and all of the commands of demands of the prophet are based on these two commandments. And it's really two sides to one coin. So how do I love God? By truly loving my neighbor
Mm-hmm.
as myself. And how do I love my neighbor as myself? I do so by seeking and practicing loving God.
Amen. Yeah.
Uh,
I think that passage
those
is so
things can't be
pertinent.
bifurcated. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's so good. It definitely reminds me, maybe even selfishly and personally, as the ways that I've viewed my own relationship with Jesus as private or personal.
Yeah.
And that invitation is so stirring, even for me as a church leader. To love God is not just to hide myself in a closet and pray, although that is something we should be doing and it's helpful.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
that love should be spilling out into the public arenas where we find ourselves, especially on our street where we see the same people every day as they go into their homes or are walking their dogs. And so I think that's such a beautiful and important place to start. That call from Jesus, this greatest command, to love God and to love others,
Sure.
this kind of that reciprocating relationship. So I appreciate
Yes.
that. The second
Yes.
question I would have and would love to move into is, okay, since we know that from the words of Jesus Himself, we are called to love our neighbor. The next
Yeah.
important question to ask is, who is our
Who's
neighbor?
our neighbor? Yeah. Totally.
And the other question
Yeah.
I'd have is, would you like to be my neighbor, Joe? I'm just kidding.
I used to.
You
Sadly, I lived a
did,
block
yeah.
away.
This was before we knew each other. But yeah, who is our neighbor?
Yeah, that's a great question. I as I think about that question, my mind goes to Luke, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, right? So there's this beautiful Luke's chapter 10 starts with this sending out. So you see this proclamation demonstration kind of relationship too, the proclaiming of the good news,
Yeah.
but then also the demonstrating of the good news in the demonstration of loving our neighbor. So Jesus sends His disciples out, but then the end of the chapter ends with this beautiful story of the Good Samaritan, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So again, another fair scribe is testing Jesus on what is the greatest commands, and Jesus, it's reaffirmed as I just said in Matthew 22 here in Luke 10.
Absolutely.
But Jesus goes on to describe as our neighbor as those who may not look like us, think like us, or outside of our tribe. I think we can kind of be a tribal people and like to stick within our own groups and homogenous groups, maybe within a belief system or an ethnicity or geography. But Jesus broadens the definition of neighbor beyond what is our comfort zone.
Right.
And of course, the Samaritan story is a shocking one, as this individual Jesus upholds as someone who's really taking God's commands seriously to love neighbor, as someone who's kind of offensive in the eyes, described as an offensive person in the eyes of Jesus' Jewish audience. But to answer your question, it's people that transcend our own comfort zones or perhaps even borders. But even so, specifically as we talk about in this conversation today, it is my literal next door neighbor. So it's someone geographically local in this case too, within the context of our conversation. But it's really anyone. Jesus opens the door really in this definition of like our neighbor is anyone outside of ourselves.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if you add to that, please.
No, that's good. Well, I love the characterization because there's kind of in my mind right now, it's much bigger than just two polar ends. But there's one that, and I'm generalizing, but there's one end that says my neighbor is everyone, and that kind of makes it too big.
Okay, now
right?
what?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now I don't love anyone because I don't know. I'm paralyzed. I don't know what to do. And then the other one is very hyper localized and says my neighbor is just the person who owns the house next to me or rents the house or apartment next to me. So there's kind of Jesus kind of breaking down those barriers. And I love how you brought up that cultural nuance because I don't want it to be lost on us. That message of the Samaritan loving the Jewish person, or the Jewish person loving the Samaritan, and how those two people groups in that moment just hated each other with a certain type of veracity. So Jesus is saying, look, your neighbor is not going to look like you. It's not going to sound like you. And maybe even more critical for our understanding. This is where I was going. For our understanding today, it might be contextualized as it's not going to be the same person who votes for the same president or votes in the same category of political ideology. It's not going to be that person who agrees with your theological perspective on the Bible, right? Like it just breaks down those barriers and begins to, I guess, affirm the actual posture of followers of Jesus as people who love everyone. And I think, I definitely think it's true that your neighbor is everyone, but I think even more practically, your neighbor becomes anyone in your sphere of influence. Your neighbor becomes anyone in your day-to-day routine that you come in contact with. And your neighbor becomes anyone that you have an opportunity to have a conversation with or drive next to, right? Like all of it really just kind of begins to implode what it means to be a neighbor. So kind of moving then, since we have this framework, we know we're called to love our neighbor from Jesus. We know who our neighbor is. What are some practical ways, like what does this look like in ordinary life, on our streets, in our grocery stores, at home, at work, to love our neighbor well? And what I would love for you to maybe explain is you wrote a really long paper that I read and I loved and I enjoyed. It was this paper called your white paper on kind of just mission or loving your neighbor or evangelism, some of that language. But you had these 5 behaviors that I think are so practical, so helpful, so tangible for just everyone to just digest right now. So could you walk us through what does it look like practically to love our neighbors through these 5 behaviors that you had in your paper?
Yeah. And these are
and I'll
things,
post them up there too.
Oh, great. Yeah, these are things that I'm borrowing or stealing from.
For sure.
And they've been presented by a friend of mine, a colleague, who's been working on her PhD in evangelism in the North American context, which is kind of fun. And in her research, she discovered, she surveyed over 400 individuals randomly in the community, in the city where she lives. 84% of them, these were not yet believers, non-Christians, said they were ready and willing to engage in spiritual conversations.
Got
is
it.
specifically since you've asked about evangelism.
Hmm.
But conversely, most Christians, or many of them, do not believe Christians are really willing or able to participate in that conversation with them
Yeah,
uh, because of the differing point of view. So,
that's sorry.
what?
That's a little sad.
Yeah. So what that shows is like, man, there's a deep sense of curiosity, openness, desire.
Yep.
Yet they have this view that Christians will be perhaps dogmatic,
Hmm.
uh, or, or just want to bludgeon them, or not talk about it at all because it
Right.
could be private, since
And
we
maybe
mentioned.
some of that comes from personal experience too, and not necessarily
Absolutely.
just a generalized idea.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's a variety of reasons, but and my friends laid out some postures or practices as we think about loving our neighbor. And this is in the context of engagement with, and I don't think we need to shy away from sharing the good news of Jesus, but how we do that
Right.
really matters. And that can be a great way of loving our neighbor, actually. But it needs to be done appropriately,
Hmm.
timely. Uh, I would say in the context of relationship and in the cultural milieu that we live in, and
Yeah.
where that's most potent, right?
Absolutely. And I
Uh,
think this framework gives us a little bit of a plan or like
yeah,
some practical steps of how to really step into that type of posture, and that's what I really appreciate about this. So sorry,
yeah.
continue, keep
No,
going.
no, no, that's good. So the first one would be to be present and to listen. So, as followers of Jesus, we need to learn to leave our agendas aside
Mm. Yeah.
and just follow the conversation with people. So, even in our COVID or coronavirus moment, which is a very significant one and is very traumatic for many people, it still lends to opportunities to connect, even in a
Yeah.
driveway, at the trash cans or the mailbox within a safe distance, or even over the phone or over the fence. Like our neighbors, we got some gardening going on together,
There
and
you
so
go.
we meet at the fence appropriately. But the opportunity for us to be present with them and to listen to how they're doing, opportunities to hear from them what's going on internally,
Yeah.
uh, and learn to follow the conversation versus steer it
Right.
towards a certain goal or agenda or outcome that we have. So that's the
Right.
first one, and the second one in the
Yeah, I'll
context.
jump in
Oh,
real
go ahead,
quick because
please.
I'd love to add because I think in some sense this cultural moment of this COVID has actually lent towards people being more willing to have conversation and to say
Yeah.
hello. So I've been walking in my neighborhood and I've never had so many people look at me in the eye and say hello as to like right now, which is crazy, but it's true
It's
because I
humanizing us.
it totally is. And that's what it's done. Like COVID has humanized us again, where we actually realize the potential for danger as we walk on the street and we're willing to like have conversations with people. But there's this quote from David Augsburger, and I think I stole this from you,
Mm,
but
this
he
is a good.
says, being heard and loved is so close together that most people can't tell the difference. It's
Yeah.
so good. Yeah, present, show up, listen,
Yeah.
have conversation. But you can go to the next one.
Yeah, and that's a great quote because the way people often receive love is just being listened to and heard.
Yeah.
So having the time and space to do that well. Um, Finding common ground is the
Yeah.
second one. It's like building a relational bridge rather than focusing on how we're different. Like, what are the things that bring us together or that we
Hmm.
have in common? Shared values, beliefs, goals.
Yeah.
I was on a call last night around the topic of social justice, um, and one thing I noticed that was missing. It was some folks that were concerned or having conversation around social justice in the church, and one of the things that was in the back of my mind in that conversation is like, gosh, there's so much that I share in common with those outside the
Yeah.
church
Yeah.
in terms of our concern for the direction things have gone or are going. Whether it's ecologically, environmentally, economically, racially. So, where are the things that I can find common ground within my neighbor that they care
Yeah.
about, that I care about? And
Hmm.
I promise you, they're there if we listen and pay attention.
Yeah.
And find ways that I can stand shoulder to shoulder with me. Maybe not physically in this moment, but I can stand shoulder to shoulder with them in thought, in passions, and
Yeah.
concerns.
And this is where I think we have to remind ourselves that people aren't projects. There's
Yeah,
actually there's so much to be said in the value of cultivating genuine relationship with people. And I think that is a big process of loving. And what that means is that we're going to be okay with tension. We're going to be okay with being wrong in certain situations or settings. We're going to be committed to peacemaking. We're going to be committed to relationships because we value people more than we do value our own theology or ideology or whatever we're holding dear. And stepping into those relationships with people, I think the best way to say it is like, I will love you as much as I will love you the same now as I will even if you reject Jesus, or at some point you make a decision and say no, or if you say I think you're wrong, I'm still going to be loving and committed to you. And building those spaces for conversation, for doubt, for fear, for actual human relationship is so valuable and so important. Instead of just coming to someone and thinking they're a project, these are all the things that I know they believe that are wrong, and we're going to fix them, right? It's like we're going to be okay with that tension and striving with people in relationship throughout that process. So,
right, that's great, Lance. I love that. The next one in here, and I see it in the screen you have, is an incarnation, and I think and I've thought about this is just learning to walk in their shoes. Yeah. Walk in their shoes. In other words, understand their story. And that kind of ties into the first point about being present and listening, is like understanding where they came from.
Yeah.
What are the things that have been in their life that have shaped their worldview? Maybe the experiences they've had that cause them to think or believe a certain way. And to understand that and look for the opportunities like a detective. Look for an opportunity to connect to that, or maybe to even ultimately learn how their story connects to a bigger one that's at work in the world, right? If the meta narrative, the big story, the true story of God is that he's in a process of redeeming the world. He created it. He made it good. It's broken. It's because of sin. This world's been damaged systemically and also individually. We've been traumatized in that relationship with God. God's worked out a plan to fix it. He's redeeming creation, reconciling us to him, and he's renewing and restoring. So if that's the storyline of God, how does their story fit in there? Absolutely. And by understanding who they are, where they come from. I had a neighbor who's going through her second round of chemotherapy, and what does it look like to understand and hear what she's dealing with and battling, and where her fears are, her aches and longings. And then how does the good news, ultimately we can get to that, but how does the good news, how can it speak into that in appropriate, timely ways? But that comes through me knowing, investing the time to understand their story.
Absolutely. Investing the time. It takes time. It's a good nugget. But I think it's so important for us to step in and understand people's longings, their desires, their wants, their fears, what's motivating them, what framework are they working from. And how life has impacted where they are. Because I think ultimately that's what Jesus did for every single one of us, right? We think of Hebrews 4. Jesus understood exactly what we felt because he stepped into the human existence to save us from it, right? To save us from those deep pains and longings. And so we have a king, a savior who understands all those longings, desires. He understands what it feels like to step into this broken existence, and that's what we get to do as followers of Jesus, to do what he did and step into people's longings and desires. But the next step,
say this real quick, if I could, too, like that timeline or that timetable is different from person to person, relationship to relationship. We always need to be invested in loving and caring for our neighbor, but perhaps as God presents as a spirit leader, there's opportunities to have more specific conversations around our faith, our worldview. But that may be different for each person. So it's our job, again, to listen, kind of dual listening. We're listening to our neighbors as we listen to the Holy Spirit and lean in what he would have for us.
Yeah, for sure. That's so good. The next step or next behavior was, and just a quick shout out, these are my words in the middle. I stole what you did and I ripped it off. But I think your descriptions of these is so helpful, and I just needed like one word to throw up on the screen, so I did it. But the next one,
we both stand on the shoulders of giants. We rip them off.
Yes. So could you talk about this contextualization, or what it means to then describe all these things?
Yeah, and and again, the context of this conversation is like as we share about our life and our faith, this is learning to talk like a real person. So,
Yes.
quite simply,
Yes.
using words meant for real people and not the pews. So, how
Yeah.
we communicate matters when we communicate. The words we use, sometimes we can live in a little bit of a bubble and use
Hmm.
words that have meaning in certain ways for us, but they may just get lost in translation or be a totally
Absolutely.
foreign language for people. You know, an example of this was with my neighbor in Claremont a couple of years ago, just before we moved a little further east. Uh, his name was Gary, and he'd asked if I would help him uh, read the Bible. He'd
Mm.
never done that before. We'd had a relationship that we'd been cultivating for a couple of years, and at one point he just said, "Hey, can you teach me how to read it?" And so quite honestly, as I was trying to help him understand like 66 books compiled into one, I remembered Gary is a huge music lover. He had a huge record collection. So I used the word anthology, like a collection
There
of
you go.
albums, a collection of stories to help him understand how the Bible was assembled and the genres in terms of navigating as we read. And when I used the word anthology, like connected to music,
There you
it
go.
was it was like a light bulb for him, you know. So it's sometimes it's trying to be creative and utilize the words and the language of the
Hmm.
street, if you will, as we talk about things of substance regarding our faith.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to realize, especially in our cultural moment, that most of the language we're used to using inside the church is really not understood outside the walls anymore. I think there was at some point like a cultural consensus with language and meaning and truth, but right now, especially in this postmodern moment, those words we use don't make sense. It doesn't mean they're untrue. Like words that we talk about, sin, justification, or sanctification, like all these words we use within the church, doesn't mean they're untrue, but we need to learn to be unique and creative in
That's
describing
right.
them and using normal language for people to really understand and grasp. So it's really
Yeah, that's
good.
great.
The last behavior, though, is definitely surrounding the gospel story. So can you describe to us kind of this? I don't know. It's not necessarily linear because I think they can work in and out of each other at different stages with different people. But how does this
Mhm.
behavior or posture with the gospel work in this setting?
Yeah, it's I might have shared a little bit about this 2 points ago, but it's the idea of creating a better story than the one they've heard, the one they may know. You
Yeah.
know, for a lot of people, as you mentioned, as we live in a post-Christian era, a lot of people that don't have a lot of experience or background with the Christian faith at all. Like in this case, my neighbor Gary, he's like, I've heard of Jesus and I've heard of Moses, but that's about all I know. So it was like
Right.
blank canvas.
Hmm.
But in some cases, there's narratives about the Christian faith that people have heard and known, or maybe grew up with, and it's helping to learn to tell a better story. There
Right.
is a God who's on mission, motivated out of love. He did not come to condemn the world, John 3 tells us, but he came to rescue it.
Yeah.
And this is how he's doing it, right? And so learning to talk about stories of hope, finding like I don't want to derail my thought here, but like learning to point towards a greater story of hope, a greater
Yeah.
story of
Amen.
restoration. And I think particularly in this unique time where it is not uncommon for people to be living with a sense, you know, in the uncertainty that we're all living
Hmm.
in, there can be a sense of real deep fear. And this is a traumatic time for many people.
Yeah.
It's a very scary or fearful time for people. And what an opportunity for us. It doesn't mean we don't have fears, we don't have concerns either, but our hope, what we look to for direction and perspective, is one
Yeah.
of a God who is at work and is on the move to make things right again.
Yeah.
And the ability for us to kind of be better storytellers, to tell others what that looks like, even hyper contextually in my own life or your own life, in our own community, to share those stories that point people towards a greater story.
Absolutely.
Sweet opportunities for us.
Yeah, and I think the important thing for us to realize is it's not about the right language or theology
Mm-hmm.
or intellect or eloquence. It's about really displaying weakness and humility. Like, how has Jesus transformed you How has
Yeah.
Jesus, in his good story, taken you from that kingdom of darkness to that kingdom of light? I think when we
Yeah.
become good people at telling our own stories, the
Yeah.
gospel story becomes more real and relevant to everyone.
That's right.
And we get to tell how we've been made new, how the sin and brokenness that we have so struggled and the shame and guilt that we have dealt with has been made new in Jesus, and we get to tell that story. And I think
That's
that's
right.
one. That's the good story to tell.
Oh man, for
Because
sure.
I think often when we think of evangelism, and I'm speaking really generally, so forgive me for whoever's listening, but evangelism is often the ability to motivate people through fear. At least in my own experience, that's what the church has done. Is we try to guilt people, we try to fill them with fear so that they make a decision to follow Jesus. But when you look at Jesus in his own ministry, oftentimes what he was doing was he was revealing the cultural norm that was empty and then replacing it with that valuable work of the kingdom and how that forgiveness heals and renews people and all of creation. And I think that's what we get to do. We get to expose the flaws of the secular world. We get to show the cracks and the emptiness of what it means to pursue things other than Jesus. And we get to backfill it with our own story of how Jesus has brought meaning, fulfillment, and value to our lives, this purposeful existence in sharing the good news of Jesus. And that is
Yeah.
something good and valuable. That's something we all get to do as the body of Christ.
Yeah. And I would say, just to, if I may,
Please do, yeah.
uh, expand on something you shared earlier about like knowing the story of the gospel at work in us. Like that's a super important piece to this, because if we're not taking time to learn how to slow down and just take inventory on how we're doing and what the gospel is speaking to us today and how it's
Yeah.
transforming us today, ultimately I can't give what I don't have.
Yeah.
And so if I'm not experiencing life on the vine, rich communion with God, no pun intended, sorry, rich connection, communion with
Yeah,
God,
amen.
life on the vine, like how am I supposed to dispense that in a way that's life giving and generative to others? So this is a really important piece about our own self care, but most importantly, our own connection to Jesus and the good news of the
Absolutely.
kingdom and how it's forming me and transforming me,
Amen.
which is a good foundation for what it looks like to be a good storyteller to the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So to end our conversation, I guess I mainly just wanted to pose a question. So I saw this. Check this
Your
out.
tech skills are impressive.
I know
Oh, I
you
got
like
three
that.
likes. What?
This was early. It was
Okay.
an hour after posting, so give yourself some grace. But what I love is you are thinking in ways that I don't normally, and I think I can speak for a lot of people, that we don't normally think in as we look towards loving our neighbor. And so you had posted this on your Instagram, and I think it is such an awesome question, such a valuable question that I would like to leave with everyone who's listening, whoever watches in the future. I would love for you to start typing in answers in the chat or leaving a comment. But what are those assets? What are those possessions, materials, goods, skills? What are those ideas, tools, or resources that God has given you, that He's blessed you with,
Yeah.
that you can utilize or leverage to love your neighbors well? And this can come out in a lot of creative ways. I've seen people writing letters to neighbors and dropping in their mailbox, offering for prayer or maybe running errands or grocery shopping for them. I've seen people draw beautiful pictures on their sidewalk with chalk, just encouraging messages for people who walk by their house. But there's so many ways to do it. The truth is our imaginations have to be unlocked to be able
Yeah.
to steward what God has given us well, to love our neighbors. And so I don't know if you have any ways or creative ways that you and your family have learned to love your neighbors well. If you want to just take a second to share.
Yeah. This was a post I'd I'd put up on my social media in response to a conversation we had with our kids around the table at dinner. This goes back to earlier in the very beginning of our conversation about the dynamics within the church that can exist. That the work of the ministries for the paid professionals, and
Yeah.
um, that there's this clergy layman dynamic where it's like, well, I'll just write a check and they'll let them take care of the rest. That
Yeah.
can exist in my heart and in many people's for sure. But the invitation is for us as people of God is to live in the mission wherever God has us.
Yeah.
So in this unique moment, we had a conversation around our dinner table to say, hey, what are the resources, assets in our home, kids? What do you see? What can you do? What can you imagine or create? So your talents, your time, your resources, our finances, our kitchen. We've been blessed with a kitchen that has a nice oven. My daughter loves to bake, and that's been therapeutic for her in a personal way. But she's been baking stuff for our neighbors, providing bread, treats, cookies,
That's
just a
awesome.
simple way. So like that's unleashed in my daughter, her imagination and the vocational stewarding of her own talents
Yeah.
and passions, to love our neighbors. So that question, it's asset-based community development as a philosophy or a framework for developers, for builders to think what are the natural strengths or assets in this community to help it flourish. I think we can hyper contextualize that locally to our own home, and entertain that question: what's around us? The garden I have out back that I could use to help feed my neighborhood,
Yeah.
with fresh vegetables. Like my neighbor Ray. My neighbor Ray is our auto mechanic, but he's rough and gruff and has these huge mechanic hands, but he's also got this beautiful green thumb. And the front of the backyard is a lush garden, and so he's literally dispensing cucumbers and artichokes and
That's
spinach
awesome.
all over our neighborhood. So that's a way Ray is loving
So
uh,
beautiful.
our
Yeah.
neighbor, right? As an example.
So good.
Yeah,
Well, Joe, thank you so much for taking some time, brother. I think this conversation's so valuable, and I had just fun talking to you as
yeah, man.
usual. But thanks for joining me. For anyone who was live, a shout out to Chase, who also thinks it's an important conversation. Good to hear from you, Chase. Uh, for those watching afterwards, we'd love to start teasing out some creative ways that maybe you have loved your neighbors, or maybe ways that you've seen people through social media or even in your own neighborhood love others who are around them. So post it in the comment section. Give us some ideas of how you think you can meet your neighbors and love them well. Maybe thinking through what you're really good at doing, those assets that you can utilize to love your neighborhood. But again, I think this is such a valuable moment for us to be considering, what does it look like for us to love well, especially when people are literally stuck in their neighborhood who are hyper local because they can't go anywhere, and who are more than ever willing to have conversations and to really dive into relationship at a safe distance, but have been more
Yeah.
than ever willing to. How can we as God's people be his presence on your street, to love our neighbors well? So we'd invite you to comment, to engage, and to really dive into helpful ways that you might be able to do the same. So thanks for tuning in, guys. Appreciate all of you.
Right on.